Will someone let me know when we're ready to start? We're ready. Okay, wonderful. Good evening, everybody. My name is Leah LaRue, and I'm the Director of Neighborhood Planning Units for the City of Atlanta's Department of City Planning. I would love for, I can see Tony. Would you give me the thumbs up to let me know you can hear me, Tony? Wonderful. Thank you so much. All righty. So I'm joined tonight by our team, and we will introduce them momentarily. I want to first welcome you to the Department of City Planning's NPU University. This is a brand new course that we have tonight for our in honor of our 50th anniversary of the NPU system. I am very happy to welcome you to NPU University, particularly those of you that are here for the very first time. I want to welcome you to CP1009, which is our History of Neighborhood Planning Units. This is in our civic participation track. NPU University has 4 tracks, and this is our civic participation track, CP1009. Welcome, welcome, welcome. While we move to the next slide, I'm joined tonight by a few of our coworkers. I see Ide Santana. Ide.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone.
Ide is our program operations manager. I also see tonight Tony McNeil, who's our program coordinator senior for outreach and engagement.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to be here.
And of course, we have Samantha Terry. Are you still on the phone, Sam?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Okay, wonderful. Sam is our NPU registrar and program coordinator senior for education and training. She was helping some folks get into the room. And again, I'm Leah LaRue. I'm the director of neighborhood planning units. So quickly, I'll go into our classroom rules for those that either are new to NPU University or you may need a reminder or refresher. Please do keep your microphones muted at all times. Grab a pen and paper to keep notes. And this is also a good time to grab a snack if you are like me and need a snack to get through a class. If you would like to take notes, this is a really good time to grab a pen or a piece of paper or whatever note-taking devices you use. If you are taking this class for credit, if you're enrolled in the in the Citizen Planner Certificate Program, our CPC, if you're enrolled in that program and you are taking this class to receive course credit, please do keep your cameras turned on in order to receive credit. If you have any questions during Q&A or the appropriate time, please raise your hand to get in the queue, and I'll show you how to do that momentarily. And our most important rule, our golden rule, all questions must be relevant to course content. Please limit your questions to those that are relevant to course content. If you would like to raise your hand during the class, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says reactions. If you click on that button, you'll get a small pop-up box that at the bottom of that box says raise hand. If you'll click on that button, you will raise your hand and be entered into the queue. If you have not done this in a while or you've never done it before, you can go ahead and practice now, and we'll go ahead and clear out all of those raised hands. If you haven't done it before or you need to practice, feel free to do that. And those are our rules for the day. All right, so at this point, I'm excited to introduce our instructor for tonight. I'm so happy to have one of my favorite colleagues in this civic participation work. Kyle Kessler is the Policy and Research Director at the Center for Civic Innovation. He is also one of our own. He's the Vice Chairperson of NPUM, and he is also their representative for the APAB board, the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board. He's the chair's designee to that board. He has most recently served as their parliamentarian and as a member of their bylaws committee. He is an all-around city historian, and certainly an NPU enthusiast. I am so excited to welcome tonight our friend Kyle Kessler. Kyle, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you everybody for showing up this evening to learn about our NPU system and its 50th anniversary. As Leah mentioned, let's see, make sure I can fully function here. My name is Kyle Kessler, Policy and Research Director at Center for Civic Innovation, and been involved with NPU-M since 2006 or so when I moved downtown, became involved in my neighborhood association, and then that led to the inevitable, there's something more than just your neighborhood association. So got connected with my NPU, and I appreciate my NPU-M colleagues that are on the call this evening, but for you, no matter where you are across the city, welcome. And even if you're not in the city, welcome, and hopefully you'll learn something about something that's special to the city of Atlanta. So I have a few learning objectives. Hopefully we'll get these covered. And if you have any questions, as mentioned, feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to take it as appropriate, or put some information in the chat. I'll try to stay on top of the chat. And if the NPU team can also keep an eye on the chat, and if there's something particularly relevant or a robust discussion, just make sure that it comes to my attention either via the chat as well, or take yourselves off mute as appropriate and let me know. But first off, I want to make sure that folks get an understanding of what led to the creation of the NPU system and what the vision at that initial creation was about. Learn about some of the people and processes that went into making the NPU system, being able to trace some of the changes that have happened across the history of our NPU system, as well as understanding a comparison between how it was set up and how it's currently operating. So keep me honest, and hopefully you'll pick up some of these pieces of learning along the way. So most of you, if you know anything about the NPU system, it's about this guy. It's about Maynard Jackson. And that's basically the short story, is that Maynard Jackson, quote unquote, created the NPU system back in 1974. Well, to a certain degree he did, because it was his signature that we'll take a look at later on a piece of legislation that made the NPU system come into being. But obviously there's a much longer, richer story. Otherwise this class wouldn't be as long as it's going to be, that we can get into and share with you some of the backstory on the NPU system. But if nothing else, you'll learn that his first stroke of the pen related to the NPUs was not to create the NPU system, it was to veto the council's initial ordinance that would have created a different system than we have, and we'll talk about some of those differences as we get through the presentation. So first off, some of the precursors. Obviously, the city of Atlanta existed pre-1974, and people in Atlanta in their neighborhoods were organizing and getting involved in various ways. So some of what that looked like back then, before we had the NPU system, was a variety of citizens advisory committees. So either the council or the alderman back at that point, or the mayor would create a body of citizens, folks that they knew, folks they were connected with, to have conversations, to give them advice. Over the years, those covered a variety of topics, whether it was about traffic, which is still a conversation today, about safety, about building codes, about parks, all sorts of things. They were temporary bodies that met with the council or the board of aldermen, met with the mayor, came up with some recommendations, helped advise on things, but they weren't persistent. Some of the things we did have that were persistent, though, were neighborhood groups. There were folks that were forming garden clubs and civic clubs and all sorts of things in their various corner of the city. Some of the things that more directly sort of led to or were in action leading up to the creation of the NPU system was the Atlanta Urban League had created a council of neighborhood organizations that were focused on community improvement as well as social welfare. There was the All Citizens Committee for Better City Planning, which is a lot of a name, but it was created in opposition to the Peyton Road barrier down in Southwest Atlanta back in 1962. So maybe you've heard about that. And the opposition to things, and the opposition particularly to traffic or to road conditions and accessibility has been a recurring theme. We'll get back to that some more as we go through as well. Next up, the Morningside Lenox Park Association was created in opposition to the State Department of Transportation looking to literally plow through those neighborhoods with a new interstate, I-485. There was the community chest, which is the equivalent of the United Way these days. They created the Community Council of the Atlanta area, and that was focused on, once again, making sure that there were social services and we were dealing with various sort of issues across the city of Atlanta. And then lastly, the Citywide League of Neighborhoods, which we'll talk about a little bit more, or I'll talk about more a little bit in a minute, which was trying to specifically campaign and advocate and make sure that folks who had neighborhoods on their mind were being elected to office in the city of Atlanta. So zooming out a little bit from the city of Atlanta, where some of this stuff got started, there were federal influences, there were federal programs that led to the creation of the EMPU system. President Lyndon Johnson was president from 1963 to 1969. One of the first things he did in office was to sign the Voting Rights Act. You can see him here with Atlanta native Martin Luther King Jr. in the background. But he had a whole campaign called the Great Society. There are various programs, federal programs that were related to that. The war on poverty is one of the things that he was particularly known for. And thank you, Forrest, for posting in the chat about the Peyton Road Affair. That's my wingman. I'm typically his wingman at the MPU meetings, and he's helping me out here at MPU University. But one of the things specifically out of that overall Great Society program that led to the creation of the MPU, or an inspiration for the MPU system, was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And one key phrase in that piece of legislation was about maximum feasible participation. So the overall spirit of that was to make sure that folks that were going to be affected by these various government programs had some opportunity to engage in the decision-making processes, to be advisors on these programs, how dollars were being spent, what programs were being prioritized and implemented. As you might try to parse these words today, it can be a little bit challenging. It's almost oxymoronic, one about being, maximum, as much as you can do, and then feasible, sort of, paring that back down. There are all sorts of academic papers and analysis on what these words mean and trying to figure out how they would be implemented. So various stakeholders leaned either towards the more maximum, that the government needed to do literally as much as possible to make sure that folks participate. And other folks were like, we're only doing what's feasible. If it's impractical, if it's going to cost too much money, take too much time, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do it. We're just going to do as much as we can that is feasible to do. So how did that start to play out in the Atlanta context? We had a local branch or chapter organization spun off of the Economic Opportunity Act here in Atlanta, which was Economic Opportunity Atlanta. This is one of the first three-letter acronyms you'll see throughout the presentation. But it was created in 1965 here in Atlanta. They had a structure that wasn't too dissimilar from the MPU system. They had a group of, they first created a citywide citizens advisory committee, but folks knew that working across the whole city wasn't necessarily the best way to have real rooted conversations and decisions about what's happening in these specific neighborhoods. And you can see the various neighborhood centers that they had here on the map. So there are a bunch of folks that decided to start creating their own ad hoc groups, not with official permission from anybody, but hey, we're in this geography, we're in this neighborhood together. Let's start programming and thinking about what is best for our neighborhood. So November of 1965, spurred on by some of the folks in Washington, they decided to create an official structure that recognized neighborhood groups, the Citizens Neighborhood Advisory Councils, that fed into a central Citizens Advisory Council. And then that Citizens Advisory Council was able to appoint 4 members to an overall Economic Opportunity Atlanta, or EOA, Board of Directors. What I didn't mention before is Economic Opportunity Atlanta, EOA, in Atlanta was focused on job training, on adult education, on loans to small businesses, all about trying to address the underlying roots of unemployment and poverty. So that's what they were sort of focused on. So not all the areas of planning that the MPUs would be later focused on, but a core group of those activities were what EOA was working on. So the EOA Board of Directors, that top level that was trying to address these issues across the city, just to give a little bit of insight as to who was making up that group of people. So even not down at the neighborhood level where you had lots of folks just being plugged in who were salt of the earth sort of people, if you will. But at the executive level, yet executives, this is a quote from a publication, and if you haven't noticed already and throughout the presentation, there's going to be citations at the bottom to where this material is found. When you get a copy of this presentation afterwards, you'll be able to source this material as well and go a lot deeper on any of these things. But executives, domestic workers, ministers, college students, housewives, educators, disabled seniors, political leaders, all sorts of folks were at these conversations. And as mentioned at the tail end of that quote, the doors were open to the public. So this was something that anybody could at least access. Even if you didn't have a literal seat at the table, you at least could be in the room to hear the conversation. So tying back a little bit to Maynard Jackson, Maynard Jackson's first wife, Bunny Jackson Ransom, she worked for EOA for 5 years as a contract specialist, as a program coordinator, as a director of planning and program development. So she was not just the first lady she would become, but she has direct connections to what would become the MPU system. But it was awfully convenient, as we'll get to in just a few minutes, when Maynard became the mayor of Atlanta and needed to form a citizen participation structure. She had lots of firsthand experience that she was able to bring into the conversation she had with him. As she told myself and others over the years recently, before her passing, was that this was part of the pillow talk. This was the sort of conversation she'd be having in the evenings with her husband, Maynard, after he got elected to office as the mayor of Atlanta. So I'll switch back. So Bunny is the one on the right. That's Bunny on the right with the dark sunglasses. And Maynard is there in the middle, and his mother is on the left. So another good place to start, and as I referenced a little bit before, some of those organizations, the neighborhood organizations that were created in opposition to transportation projects that were coming through. Just before the creation of the MPU system, we were leading towards the creation and construction of the MARTA rail system. But Atlanta is known these days, if you look at a sort of very, very simple map of Atlanta, it's about interstate highways. And lots of these interstate highways were being planned through Atlanta. You have the downtown connector, you have the perimeter. Lots of these were coming through established neighborhoods. And as they continued to go through more and more neighborhoods, folks got very opposed to it. So even though some folks, this is from the Great Speckled Bird, were sort of jokingly referring to this as progress, there were definitely folks that were, calling up their neighbors, showing up and trying to figure out how they could stop the literal destruction of their neighborhood by bulldozers and other equipment to try to get people who were fleeing the city, who were moving further out, to be able to get quick access back into downtown for their jobs. Folks were like, no, we want to make sure that our neighborhoods are here, that people can live and have a good quality of life in the city. So as I mentioned, some of these highways are recognized, some of them actually do exist, but some of these in red, which were still being proposed at the time of the creation of the MPU system, were still just on the drawing boards. As I mentioned before, the Morningside Atlantic Park Association was created to try to stop 485 from coming through their neighborhood. But there were other folks that were interested in stopping construction through their neighborhoods as well. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. Some of them changed the course of some of these roads or completely downgraded them or sort of changed the character of what these roads would be coming through their neighborhood. One of the folks that I've been able to have a conversation with and help sort of guide some of this research was Joseph Drolet, who was one of the lead organizers of the Citywide League of Neighborhoods, and helped to stop some of the road construction in his neck of the woods. But not just stopping things, but also wanting to make sure that there were opportunities for folks who wanted to live in the city to renovate their houses, to be supporting small businesses. Those sorts of activities were things that they were keenly aware of. But as a sort of differentiating point from lots of other associations around that time, they were really focused on not just stopping the project, convincing the Department of Transportation to not do something, but they were trying to actively pull together neighborhoods across the city, both northeast and southwest and everywhere in between, to come up with a slate of candidates, folks they could endorse for office that had that they felt would convey neighborhood ideas and be supportive of neighborhoods, in contrast or in opposition to what they felt were the downtown business interests. And as a FYI, I'm coming to you from downtown in NPUM, but wanting to make sure that folks, that they could have good people in power who would be able to be thinking about considering neighborhood interest and not just thinking about folks from the suburbs coming in or the downtown business interest. So another place where the MPU system got its start was with Grace Towns Hamilton. She was instrumental. She was the driving force behind the Charter Commission that got established, that gave Atlanta its first new charter since 1874. So for 100 years, there have been some incremental changes to the foundational document for the city of Atlanta, but no sort of wholesale rethinking of how the city should function, how it should be organized. And we had grown in sort of piecemeal ways, and things had happened, incrementally, little bit by little bit, but over time, things had sort of gotten backed up. Things weren't working very well. So she wanted to make sure, as soon as she got into office in 1966, one of the things he really championed was trying to get the charter of the city of Atlanta rewritten. Much of her interest was around representation. She was the first African-American female in the Georgia legislature. The representatives on the Board of Aldermen were not, they did not look like the face of Atlanta at that point. I'll get to more of that in just a second, but she wanted to make sure that if there was a growing Black population in the city of Atlanta, that the folks in power who were making decisions for Atlantans looked like that. So some of the changes in that 1974 charter versus what we had coming up from 1874 through 1973 was we had what was officially called a weak mayor. So not that the mayors before Maynard Jackson were weak in their spirit, but as far as weak in the sense of their political power. Everything was sort of mixed up between the executive and legislative functions of government. So rather than having a clear delineation between the two, you had, for instance, the committee members, the committee chairs of each of the Board of Aldermen's committees, which is what they were called back then. They basically were the folks who ran the departments. There were professionals who went to City Hall every day who were in charge of those things, but their direction was coming from each of the committees and not from a mayor who was directing things across departments. It was very much a sort of siloed way to do it, and the folks that were writing the laws would also be administering the laws, which was very not good, which is something that Grace Towns Hamilton wanted to fix. There was the name change from the Board of Aldermen to the City Council. There was a change in the number of folks that were involved. We had 9 Board of Aldermen districts or wards, as they were called back then. The new plan was to have 12 districts, but we had 6 at-large. If you're familiar with council today, there's only 3 at-large. That was a change later in 1996. But back in 1974, we had 12 districts, which we still have today, and 6 at-large council members. We did planning in Atlanta, but it was not typically or ever really comprehensive. It was very piecemeal. Once again, it was on a particular subject matter. Typically, it was also citywide. We weren't doing neighborhood level planning. It was trying to figure out how big projects like MARTA or interstate highways would come through, and not trying to figure out the unique character of neighborhoods across the city. As I showed before, there were some opportunities for citizen input. There were occasionally those citizens advisory committees. There would be a public hearing or two, but nothing that was really guaranteed that a project would not even be contemplated without some sort of input from the citizens of Atlanta. So we're going to get into a lot of words here, but once again, you're going to get the presentation afterwards. So I'll go through this fairly quickly, but wanted to literally sort of highlight some of the things that were in this charter revision, particularly related to planning and how it impacted what became the MPU system. And I have heard quite a lot from folks over the years that the MPUs are in the charter system, or that Maynard put it in the charter. It's not in the charter. It wasn't in the charter. It's close. What we have is a result of what was in the charter. The charter did pre-exist Maynard. Maynard was elected the same time the charter went into effect. But if I need to dispel some myths or urban legends, MPU system was not literally in the charter, and it was not Maynard that put it there. It was not anybody who put it in the charter, because it's not in the charter. But the charter led to the things that gave us the MPU system. So first up, planning was a little broader, I think, than we think about often today, when we're often thinking of just land use, maybe or just transportation. But they were trying to plan the physical, the social, the economic. So almost anything you can think of, category-wise, was part of this planning effort. And once again, wanted to be comprehensive, wanted to be across the whole city, but unique to this time, and based upon conversations and folks showing up at some of these charter commission meetings. The citizens of Atlanta said, we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for some geographic specificity, that our community's desires and plans can be part of this comprehensive plan. So they were thinking about parks, recreation, public safety, a variety of things such as housing, land use classifications, lots of things we were thinking about. They were thinking about that as part of the comprehensive development plan. But how most specifically we get to things like the MPU system was that the mayor was required, per the charter, to have a series of hearings in each of the council districts before this plan can be adopted. So once again, trying to put a little bit of brakes and not let the council and the mayor just sort of do whatever they want. But before they're allowed to adopt the comprehensive development plan, they needed to have a series of public hearings across the city. And it was the mayor's job to have hearings, and then it was the council's job to have hearings. The council did not have an obligation to have them across the city. They could have public hearings much the same way they have many hearings today, in that they tell you what time to show up at City Hall, and you could go downtown, go to City Hall, speak for a few minutes, and be done. But the mayor had to make sure that he was getting folks across the city to be able to engage in the planning process. And then lastly, the preparation of this plan wasn't just for planning's sake, but this plan was required by charter to be the guide for the budget of the city of Atlanta, specifically the capital budget, which if you're engaged in the comprehensive development plan and other things today, you'll understand that there's connection to the capital improvement element and other components that still sort of exist over the years. But I'll get to it in a few minutes how things went beyond the charter with what Maynard and the city council and other folks came up with. So we weren't necessarily limited by the charter, but we had these obligations to meet because of what was put in the charter that was adopted in 1973 by the Georgia General Assembly, signed by then Governor Jimmy Carter, and then was the operating document that the brand new council and a brand new mayor, Maynard Jackson, had to take over when he came into office in 1974. So in this little interim, though, between the charter being adopted and folks coming into power, the Department of City Planning, or its equivalent back at that time, was busy because they knew, per the charter, that there was going to need to be some neighborhood planning. So started using some federal dollars to have conversations and to get some materials out to folks about why this is important. Hopefully, if you're engaged in NPU University or engaged in NPU, you understand some of the value of neighborhood planning. But this was something that was pretty unique to Atlanta and pretty unique to Atlantans. They hadn't had the opportunity to really engage in this sort of way before. So the city wanted to help make sure that folks had some sort of grounding before they were expected to show up at meetings and give their input. Instead, give them some tools to be better prepared for that. So now getting into the literal creation of the thing that was the MPU system. So if you're familiar with how local government works, which is similar to how state and federal government works, with the differentiation of the branches of government, no matter what Maynard Jackson wanted to do when he came into office in January of 1974, if it's about legislation, he can't really do it. You have to have folks that are on the council who are introducing that legislation, passing that legislation. So one of the very key figures in this was John Ash Calhoun, who was elected at age 74. So Maynard Jackson was in his 30s, and John Calhoun was in his 70s when he came into office. But he had been involved in grassroots organizing for quite some time. He was also someone who worked at Economic Opportunity Atlanta, so was connected into that system of engagement based upon federal programming. And he might be one of the few people, or he might be one of the few reasons why the NPU system has ever gotten into the New York Times. It was mentioned in his obituary in 1988 that this was one of the key things that his legacy was about, was the NPU system. So getting to exactly what the NPU system is and the ordinance that brought it into being, here's a few snippets of it. As stated before, we'll make sure that you get full access to the document that sort of brought the NPU system into being, but sharing the intent, right? That this intent is not what's in the code today. It has been lost, if you will, because not everything that the council writes down gets codified into the code of ordinances. So this is a piece that was not necessarily lost to time, but you'd have to go dig to find out what did the people who were trying to put the NPU system together, why they needed to create it, what was their rationale for it. So as stated here, they knew they had to have comprehensive planning. That's what the charter said they had to do. That in order for it to be truly comprehensive, the city must be responsive to the needs and concerns of citizens, that this plan that they're working on has to allow for a diversified and responsive citizen involvement. So they need to develop what this system would be. So there were obligations placed by the city on this, that they had to make information available that included land use, transportation, community facilities, capital improvements, housing, human resources, social and recreational programming, environmental quality, open space and parks, citizen involvement, and the planning and zoning to assist them in neighborhood planning activities, and that this information shall be presented graphically when practical. Now, if you are familiar with the Code of Ordinances, that language is still basically there today. So the city still has obligations about making information available so that neighbors know what to be able to plan with. They've got some information about what exists and how they can help shape the future of their neighborhood. So next up, the city had some obligations and neighborhoods had some obligations as well. So the neighbor's job, or what they would do, would be to recommend an action, policy, or plan to the city or to any city agency on any matter affecting the livability of their neighborhood, including but not limited to, and same things that they were giving information about, and that they could review items for inclusion in the city budget and make recommendations relating to budget items for neighborhood improvements. Once again, that language is basically intact from the very first piece of proposal for the NPU system as we know it today. And then lastly, this piece also persists today, that there will be neighborhood planning committees that will be accountable to the residents of the area that they represent. When doing research on this, this piece surprised me, sort of how it came into being, in that I would have guessed that this was something that the city wanted to pass the buck to the residents and say, y'all have to be accountable. But actually, this amendment was proposed by a group of residents in Southwest Atlanta that were already sort of organizing pre-NPU system. And they wanted to make sure that if the folks were there at a meeting saying that they were speaking on behalf of residents of Southwest Atlanta, that they were truly being accountable, held accountable to the folks there. What was originally proposed and then got pared down through some discussions in the council meeting was there was a longer list of how those NPUs would be accountable, including that they needed to provide certain information regarding the dates and times of their meetings and whatever else. That was stricken. And as you know today, the city plays a key role in letting folks know about the particulars of the NPU system. You can go to the city's website to see the agendas, that sort of stuff. So even back then, there was some let the administration take care of certain things. But as far as the decisions that are being made and the conversations that are being had, there was a desire from the very beginning that folks would be accountable to what they're presenting. If they're trying to represent a full geography, they should be speaking on behalf of that, or trying to represent the opinion of that geography. Now, one thing you'll probably already notice is this terminology regarding neighborhood planning committee, which is not something we typically use today. But in the original ordinance, there were two separate things. There was the geography, which was the NPU, the neighborhood planning unit. And then there was the neighborhood planning committee, the NPC, which was the group of people that are having the meeting and voting, having the conversations, putting forth the recommendations. So over time, those things have become joined, and now we just call it NPU, whether you're talking about the people or the geography. But initially, the geography was the NPU, and the people in the NPU that were meeting and having these conversations and putting forth the recommendations were the neighborhood planning committee. So, as I teased a little bit before, Maynard Jackson's first pin movement on the NPU system was not to say it's good to go. It was to say, actually, I've got some concerns about what the council has drafted up, and let's try to get this right. So some of the things that he had some concerns with were who's coming up with these boundaries and how do they get approved. So the first piece of legislation was a little bit murky. In actuality, it still was a little murky later. But rather than just jumping straight to a map, the decision was let's come up with some criteria to figure out how we would have, where we would decide to draw these boundaries, how many NPUs there would be. All that stuff was still up in the air. Along those same lines, you had a bunch of neighborhoods, but no one quite had figured out yet, did they need to be really, really small? Should they be really, really big? Or does it not matter? And Maynard Jackson's veto letter back to the council was basically as much like, you're not giving me any direction here. Do you want more of them? Do you want fewer of them? Does it matter to you? So was hoping to get some response in the legislation to that. One of the major conflicts was about who would preside over the hearings. So council's first piece of legislation was that the council member would preside over these hearings that would be the NPU meetings. And Maynard, being a strong mayor, not just by name, but in practice with the new legislative powers mandated for the administration to be able to do, he wanted to make sure that he could maintain authority. But also, if you remember back to the charter, it said that the mayor would have a series of hearings, not the council would have a series of hearings. The council would have hearings later, but the first pass at this was what the mayor would be directing. So he wanted to make sure that we were sticking true to the charter and that the mayor and the administration would be guiding the first round of hearings. It was also unclear, it didn't really state whether or not these NPUs or neighborhood planning committees would last. Did they have any duration? Or did they only exist?
Maybe we can message each other.
Or did they only exist for the hearing? Were they bodies that would continue to meet from year to year so there would be some institutional knowledge or consistency? Or was this just, we show up at the meeting and then a completely different group of people show up at the hearings the next year? So Maynard was interested in having them persist, but the council did not explicitly allow them to continue from year to year. And then lastly, there was an organization, which I'll get to a little bit later, the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board, or APAB for short. And who would make those appointments? Was it what council might be leaning towards, where the council would be the ones making the decision? Or what Maynard Jackson preferred was that the council would nominate some people, but the mayor would make the appointment, or vice versa. Like, just needing to get some clarity as to how do folks get onto APAB. I'll go ahead and let you know, APAB was the citywide, or is the citywide body. So as I mentioned at the very top, regarding the comprehensive development plan, trying to look at two different scales, the citywide scale as well as the neighborhood or smaller geographic area. So there was some intent with this that there would be at least two scales, the citywide scale and the neighborhood level. But what council was also trying to do with this as well was that to persist that council members would be able to have some control over things in their council district and have council district planning committees. And if you, once again, are familiar with the Code of Ordinances now, there's still this vestigial piece of legislation, little line that's in there that talks about council district planning committees. We really haven't had them in almost 50 years, but that piece of legislation is still in there today. on there today. But Maynard Jackson vetoed it, and these are a summary of his issues with the initial legislation. So this was June 1974. Council got right back at it, and just in a couple months had made enough changes to the legislation that wouldn't need to get a veto or wouldn't have a veto for Maynard Jackson. So what were those changes? Well, exactly who would determine the boundaries still wasn't fully ironed out, but there was an extra sentence or a phrase put into the legislation that allowed for some provision of change in the boundaries. But as it was prepared, the planning department would come up with the criteria. The criteria would get approval from council. The planning department would come up with a map, and that map would get approval from council. There was still no real resolution on the size, but as mentioned, if the criteria are being established, then hopefully there's an opportunity through the criteria to figure out what good sort of population or geography of the MPUs might be. Whereas in the initial ordinance, there was reference to the council member presiding over the hearings. That was stricken completely. There was also language explicitly written in that the council member could not be a member of the committee. They could not engage in those sorts of activities. This was going to be a citizens plan, not just regurgitating what the council might come up with on their own. It was explicitly stated that the MPUs would be able to continue from year to year. And lastly, they kicked the can down the road just a little bit on APAB. So rather than specifically stating sort of how the members would be appointed or nominated, they just said that we'll get some legislation together soon, and we'll get that taken care of. They gave themselves a 60-day window to come up with the legislation for APAB and how those members would be selected and what the membership would be. So now the legislation's passed, but in order to do things, you can't just rely solely on the mayor. He's busy doing all the things the mayor has to do. He's got a full team of folks to be able to make sure that he can administer the city the way that the council and the citizens are expecting him to administer the city. So there was a complete reorganization of the city of Atlanta that came about along with the charter in 1974. So you needed, for the first time, you had folks called commissioners, these sort of super leaders of these larger departments that would be tackling the various challenges or opportunities that we had across the city. So one of the first people that Maynard Jackson brought in was this man, Leon Eplin, who was the first commissioner of the Department of Budget and Planning. He had been involved in the planning of MARTA and the stations, the rail stations, so was already engaged in neighborhoods across the city. He had worked on a plan for his own neighborhood in Ansley Park. So he came in literally just at the same time as the MPU ordinance was being adopted to help get all this stuff off the ground, to be able to do the comprehensive development plan, to be able to implement this new MPU system. And Maynard liked him so much that even though Leon left during his first term, that when the Olympics were announced, or when Maynard came back in preparation for the Olympics, then Maynard brought him back to the city of Atlanta. So each of them had sort of split terms, a first round, and then they came back years later to lead the city again. So one key difference between the city of Atlanta and how it functions and operates today and how the MPU system sort of fits into it in 2024 versus back in 1974 was in 1974, we had this brand new department, which was the Department of Budget and Planning. And rather than sitting sort of further down this chart where the Department of City Planning operates today, which is roughly equivalent to things like the police department or watershed management, those sorts of things, the planning department or the budget and planning department was very, very high up in the overall organizational chart, above the other sort of operating departments, because the job of planning would be to deal with all of those issues. You need to have planning for public safety. You need to have planning for transportation. So let's have that centralized, comprehensive look at it. And what they had then that we don't have now is that they were unified, or they attempted to be in conjunction on both budget and planning. So planning how the dollars are spent, as well as planning on the various programs and the locations for those projects and services. So Over time, this has shifted away, but when we're talking about, or I'm talking about the Department of Planning, think about it sort of in this position. This is where the NPU system got its start. So I showed you the booklet that was produced back in June 1973 when the charter said there needed to be some planning. But a year later, when we actually have an ordinance that says, here's how we're going to start to set this thing up, the planning department, once again, with some federal dollars, says, okay, we're going to give you some more specific guidance on how to actually do it. We're not just going to talk about it's a valuable thing to do, but instead let's give you some of the tools to be able to engage with the city in this planning process. So this was a book that was released, and once again, you'll get a link that you can access and take a look at these documents later. As I mentioned, though, so that the ordinances have been passed, or the first ordinance was passed or vetoed, and then the second one's sort of coming into being. But per that charter mandate, like we needed to be producing a comprehensive development plan in 1974. So the way to do it without setting up the whole system as you know it today was, okay, we're going to literally follow the rules that are in the charter, which says there needs to be a hearing or a set of hearings in the council districts. So what they did was have a series of hearings in the council districts. They were 2 hearings in each council district. The first one happened in the months of June and July. Not too dissimilar from lots of MPU meetings today. They were on Tuesday or Thursday nights, so sort of middle of the week, not trying to interrupt your Friday or your weekend, and trying to be late enough that hopefully you got home after traffic or whatever else you need to do, you had some dinner, and then you could go participate in this hearing. They were held at schools, which pre-pandemic, lots of MPU meetings, just in 2019 up to 2020, were also happening in schools as public facilities that folks could get to relatively easily and have accommodations for a meeting. So that was the first set of hearings where the city met with folks. They also did a questionnaire, which I'll show you a little bit of in just a second. But then for the second set of hearings that the mayor needed to do, because first you needed to hear what the citizens had to say, and then you start to present back the plans and like, did I hear you correctly? If you were at the introduction to the CDP that our current commissioner, Janae Prince, had last week, she also had the same, like, we need to go talk to you, hear what you have to say, and then we need to present back to you. And like, did we get it right? So same philosophy back then in 1974. As part of this mayor's planning week, they had what were called rap sessions. I don't think this had anything to do with hip hop or the culture or whatever else. This was just like, we need to come back and circle back with you and show you what we prepared. These, though, were different. These weren't like just a little short meeting in the evening and like you post the dot and answer some questions. These were like, we're going to be posted up in these council districts from 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 10 o'clock. So hopefully at some point in there, you can swing by, we can have a conversation with you, share what we've drafted up, and we can get your feedback. Now, after all this was done, then we go to the official sort of council hearing at City Hall in the council chambers, or the old council chambers as it was back then. So we got some documentation as to how some of these conversations went. So once again, we didn't have the full process of the neighborhood planning unit system as we know it today, but they had sent out, or they had these questionnaires available. They got 363 responses, which is a decent set of responses to 28 questions, I suppose. There were 35 different neighborhood organizations across the city that submitted some sort of plan, and not necessarily a plan the way we might be thinking of it, like pretty drawings and maps, but at least like, here's a set of goals or objectives, things that we want to accomplish, or they gave some recommendations on what the city was already sort of looking to do in their community. So that's what was sort of produced in process or in connection with the MPUs or the council district hearings leading up to the MPU system as we are more familiar with it today. So what this led to was there was a document finally produced that was comprehensive, not so much to the neighborhood level yet because there hadn't put the structure wasn't fully implemented yet. But the first piece of the comprehensive plan had a plan for citizen involvement. So once again, not just talking about the various sort of physical aspects of planning, but here's our plan over the next 1 year, 5 years, and 15 years about how we're going to flesh out the NPU system and what our expectations are of that engagement. So number one in the plan was citizen involvement. then a whole series of other things that are probably more familiar to you in planning processes if you go to various meetings about the zoning or the housing or the services, the facilities. But the plan number one was, let's figure out how we engage citizens in all of this other stuff that's to come. So we've got something off the ground. We got the legislation passed. We have a first round of conversations with people to check the box and say we did the CDP in 1975. But then we need to figure out, okay, how do we actually make this thing happen? How do we implement it? So as mentioned, there were early disputes on sort of what these boundaries might look like. Would they be based upon council districts? Would they be based upon something else? Well, let's agree to disagree and let the planning department come up with some criteria. The council can then review the criteria, come up with some maps, and figure out what it might be. So these were the initial criteria. There was a little bit of change before we got to final adoption, but this is what, in a memo from the planning director to the council in advance of the mayor's planning week, this is what the Department of Planning, Budget and Planning was proposing for the criteria. So they would be looking to figure out sort of where existing neighborhood and subdivision boundaries existed. So they didn't want to try to split an NPU across neighborhoods. They wanted to be respectful of physical boundaries. So whether that's things that nature made or whether it was things that humans were making, such as I mentioned before, MARTA tracks and highways, those sorts of things, trying to be somewhat respectful of those conditions. They were wanting to think about census tracts. So the census tract was important because the city was required to provide information to the NPUs. In order to do that, they needed good data, and the best folks to get data routinely is from the US Census. So by following the census tract boundaries, they wouldn't have to be guessing so much as to what the demographic makeup or what the other sort of classifications might be for folks. So using census tract boundaries as some guide to determine what an NPU boundary would be helpful. There was interest in making sure that there was some similarities of the people who were living there, not just like everybody all the same, but not trying to have people that are that the city knew in advance were completely in opposition to each other being drawn into the same NPU. Now, one thing that I mentioned, there were some changes from this original proposal to what got adopted in 1975. Political issues is on here in the draft. Council struck the political issues. They weren't interested in having everybody of the same political mindset being in NPU. But there should be some similar goals and objectives. There was thought about making sure that folks would be able to work together. They were looking in the same direction, not folks that wanted to take their respective corners of the city in completely different directions. Once again, the administration wasn't necessarily sure if there'd be a specific sort of population size. Through the course of conversations with the council, they did land on some numbers. They were looking to have between 15,000 and 30,000 people living in the NPUs. But key to that, they wanted to make sure that these geographies would be large enough that you could actually do comprehensive planning. That if you were just designing at the level of a subdivision or just a neighborhood on its own, you might not have all the things that makes a neighborhood. If you didn't have a park, or there wasn't a school, or there wasn't any commercial activity, then you weren't really able to do comprehensive planning. You might be able to do some housing planning, or maybe it's just some transportation planning, but trying to make sure that the geographies were big enough to be able to do comprehensive. But on the flip side, you also wanted them to be small enough that they were able to get in some level of detail and specificity versus having to be so broad brushstroke in the plan. Now, part of that too is because we already had a plan for the whole city, or we needed to produce one for the city. So trying to find that middle ground where you weren't necessarily all the way down into the block by block, but you had something that was big enough to do quote unquote comprehensive planning. So part of the struggle at this time, though, was figuring out what these neighborhoods are. There was no reason necessarily to have very hardline boundaries or to even know what a neighborhood was. If you have been on the internet anytime in the past decade or so, there are still ongoing debates about what a neighborhood is. Are we going to call it the West Side or the Upper West Side, or where does Southwest Atlanta start or end? All those sorts of things, conversations that existed, maybe not those exact same names, but trying to figure out, okay, just because this is what I call it, and this is where I think my neighborhood starts and stops, not everybody agreed on that. So map on the left from 1970 didn't even attempt to draw boundaries, but like here's just some place names that that folks recognize and a general location where those exist. But if you're going to start to draw boundaries and define these NPUs, you needed to have some maps that had some boundaries to them. So the way that started to come into being, there were folks at Georgia State University in this Atlanta Community Study Project that started having conversations with people like, where do you live? What do you call this place that you live? And what is the extent of that place that you live? So this map on the right is a little bit hard to see, but there's some red circles or sort of ovals, all sorts of odd shapes on it, where folks were trying to start to figure out, okay, this is where we call, for my instance, downtown. Downtown isn't even on the map. We weren't calling it downtown back then. It was the Central Business District. But you can start to see folks trying to grapple with, okay, where do folks live? Where are they working? What are those geographies? And once again, trying to be respectful to the criteria, starting to move towards some harder lined, less oval and circles, and more, here's a street, here's a road, here's a highway, here's the MARTA tracks, here's where folks are already organized in a certain way, and have a neighborhood organization or civic association. Let's be respectful of those boundaries, and then trying to fill in the gaps in between. Because as you notice on the map on the right, not every piece of the city is included in one of these red circles, but one of the requirements of the NPU system was that every piece of the city would be covered. There'd be no place you could be in the city limits of Atlanta and not be in a geography of an NPU. So when council, when the Department of Planning needed to start providing this information, they had a draft prepared back in 1974 in November to share at Mayor's Planning Week. They invited the council members and the public to take a look at those maps. Then in February, the resolution to actually, okay, let's adopt the criteria, which I mentioned there were a few changes from what was originally proposed. And then you need a map. So the first map that was included here as Exhibit A with the resolution was for 22 NPUs. So not what we have today, not what we even really ended up with, because in April, before the legislation got adopted, we moved from 22 to 24. And just like there can be some mistakes when you're trying to make a bunch of changes at the last minute ahead of a council meeting or try to sort of get the votes, there were some changes that happened fairly quickly with this. The first map of 22 has Midtown in NPUE, but when the map of 24 got adopted, Midtown was now in NPUF. So very quickly after the April adoption of the 24, May 1975, the Midtown Association had said, wait a minute, we prefer to be in NPUE. So the resolution got amended to put them in NPUE. Now, a few years later, 1978, there was another change where, once again, because some things had sort of been shuffled around, the Ridgewood Heights neighborhood, which is shown here in NPUA, apparently some maps had shown it in NPUC. So there was a correction to get it into NPUC, where the folks in Ridgewood Heights thought that they should have been, I guess, all along. So there had been a few tweaks to the maps, most of them fairly early on. But otherwise, the map that you would know today has been in place pretty much since 1975. So you've got the geographies, you've got that sort of set up, and now the city actually wants to meet with the people and start to form the organizations that are the NPUs or the NPCs at that point. So what the city did was send out some notifications to the organizations that they knew, somewhat relying upon the map and the work that those folks at Georgia State had done to figure out sort of what the community organization landscape looked like across the city. But the city had their maps, they had some data profiles, once again, pulling some stuff from the census, mapping out where fire stations and police stations and parks and other things are, to be able to have a conversation with folks in these various geographies across the city. And they came armed with sample bylaws. So not something you would necessarily have to adopt, but we're going to give you a framework if you're interested in it. Here's how you might organize yourselves, and here's some committees you might be looking to create, or subcommittees to look to create in order to be able to fully engage in the comprehensive plan process. So then how was the department, the planning team set up at the city? They had a special division for local planning. So there were folks working on other sorts of planning, but there was a team dedicated to local planning or the neighborhood level planning. There were 4 teams. Each of them was assigned 6 different NPUs that they all worked on as that team together. Each team had 4 to 6 planners. The teams that had 6 had more interns on them and part-time folks versus the team of 4, which had fewer interns, more full-time staff at the city. But that was the team, and each team had a combination of folks with different specialties in planning. So you weren't all getting just transportation planners, or they weren't all having just historic preservation planners, but trying to be responsive to those NPUs and what they might need. There would be an urban designer, for instance, who would be on the NPUM team, since NPUM covers downtown, where there's a lot of need for urban design. So in the middle, you can see the sort of workflow for that first year as to what the team would be working on with each of the NPUs. So first up, starting in February 1976, they were working on an inventory, trying to map out and show sort of the assets in each of the NPUs. Second, starting to do some analysis that would be happening from April through May, as shown here, trying to figure out the challenges that these NPUs were facing and what they could be working to fix, then coming up with goals, then starting to work through the plans, and then the last piece of it after things get adopted is to start to implement the plan. On the right, you can see a circular diagram of how this started to play into the overall process with the city regarding when things went to council, how they were reviewed by the various departments, but this was an ongoing process. What was in the charter before, I didn't really highlight it before, we were thinking about 3 different scales of planning, 2 different geographic scales, citywide as well as neighborhood, but 3 different time horizons for planning. There was a 15-year horizon, there was a 5-year horizon, and a 1-year horizon. And each of these need to be updated every year. That was the requirement back in 1974. So you never stopped planning, but hopefully you could also do implementation while you were planning for the next year. You'd be taking sort of lessons learned to continue to sort of build upon them. So 1977 was the first time we had gone through this full sort of NPU process. There were folks that were meeting across the city, not too dissimilar to the pre-pandemic condition. Again, folks were meeting in various public facilities, some in some churches, maybe some private businesses, but for the most part, some public facilities. Most of the meetings were starting at 7:30. Over time, some of those meetings have changed to be more reflective of when people can get to the meetings and such, or how much they might have on their agenda. As my chair from NPUM knows, we've moved our start time early and early to not have people out so late. But initially, each of the NPUs was starting roughly at 7:30 during a work weekday, not on Fridays, but Monday through Thursday. So those things were sort of becoming the norm even back then in 1976 and into 1977. But this was the first document. Once again, there'll be a link, then you can sort of dig into it more. But what's really cool, or for those who want a little more pop and color, each NPU was prepared or worked through this process with their planner team to produce this 22 by 17 inch packet, which was folded over and could be mailed or picked up at City Hall or elsewhere, which had the plan for that NPU for the next 5 years. So this is one from my neighborhood, from NPUM, showing land use, which is still a key component of the CDP today, to come up with that future land use plan. But as listed out here, it wasn't just about the graphics and the map and sort of showing what it was, but there's some narratives about what the issues, the problems, the challenges that NPU faces, as well as opportunities, getting into the land use, the transportation, the economic plans, the parks, the environment, all that stuff was there. And each one was different to the needs of those communities, but there was some form to it. Some consistency in how it was sort of structured and how the city was engaging with the NPUs across the city. But each one of these would have different set of challenges, a different land use plan, different sort of conditions that were there. But this would be something that would be produced every year. That could be something that an NPU could have as a playbook, but also something that they had worked on with their planning team to come up with what the future of their neighborhood's going to be. It's really difficult to see here, but once again, you'll get a link to it. On the map on the right is a list, it's of notes, but oftentimes that's key projects that folks in the NPU wanted to see accomplished within the next 5 years. unfortunately, you look at the plans and like some of this stuff still isn't accomplished 50 years later. But some of the things like, wow, like they were doing these things 50 years ago, or roughly 50 years ago. So you do the plan, you come up with a document, it gets passed, you work on implementation, but there starts to become this sort of routine. People are meeting together, they're trying to get better at their planning process, they're trying to share best practices. And some of how this happened back in the 1970s was a whole series of organizations and folks that were putting on convenings, gatherings, materials, newsletters to get this information out. So on the left, you have a community information clearinghouse, as well as a brochure for a neighborhood planning conference, both of which were sponsored by Georgia State University and their Urban Life program. On the right, you have some newsletters that the planning department was putting out. If you can look in real closely, you can see that Maynard Jackson was himself attending NPU meetings. They were making sure to highlight that so folks knew that Maynard wasn't just talking the talk, but also walking the walk and getting out to the NPUs across the city. So there's just a lot of communication. Once again, there was a lot of federal funding that helped the city do stuff, and you had GSU with its funding streams as well, being able to fund things on their end. But there was a lot of activity. There's lots of documentation on what was going on with the NPU system in its early days. So those might have been like the golden era. Everybody was still in the honeymoon period about what the NPUs were and could be. But there started to be some challenges. There started to be some issues that were coming up, not just issues that happen in neighborhoods, but also issues with the process, with the system, those sorts of things. So here's just a sampling of some of those headlines from local newspapers in 1978. Folks were getting real. They wanted, like, let's dig into this thing. Let's figure it out. We're facing off on these processes. What somebody in NPU might say today, hey, City Hall, you can't ignore us. Like, we're here. We're a force to be reckoned with. There were citizens airing their grievances, like it's Festivus, I guess, lambasting councilmen at hearing, but like this tension that has existed since the beginning about where the power sits. As I mentioned before, Maynard Jackson, as strong mayor, wanted to make sure that he had some power, that council wasn't taking his power away, bringing into the picture citizen involvement as well. Residents across the city wanted to make sure that they had access to the power that they thought they deserved. So reading back through some of these, and once again, we'll make sure you get links. I can read some of these stories, but some of these things, if you just change the date on when the conversation happened, you would have no idea that wasn't from your own NPU meeting last week or what happened in the city council meeting on Monday. So what the city council did do, though, is they, in their development committee, which today it's been sort of cobbled together with the Human Services Committee, but back then it was just the development committee. They formed a NPU evaluation subcommittee to have hearings, to have conversations, to figure out what tweaks could be made in the early days. You know, the system's up and running, but what lessons have we already learned that we can make some incremental improvements on? So they hired a GSU professor to do a survey. They conducted a series of public hearings at City Hall. They did telephone surveys, mail surveys, conversations with folks in city departments, with the NPUs, but also engaging folks outside. And here are some of the criticisms that were coming out back then. Once again, some of them you might still hear today. But that because we had these 24 different NPUs, they were acting different. There was no real standardization. The NPU system had provided some sample documents, some guidelines, but folks were being reflective of the people in those neighborhoods, and there was no standard that they had to follow. So that was of concern, particularly to folks at the city who were looking or needed to engage with the NPUs. There were concerns that the people who were at the meetings weren't being representative of the majority opinion. There were accusations that people were, coming in from outside the city to show up at meetings and vote. There were concerns that the people that were there were driving off other folks, or there were missing voices in the room. So that was a concern from the early days as well. And that the NPUs had lost focus, that they were getting too political, sort of delving into issues that they shouldn't be delving into, but instead stick to quote unquote planning. Now, one of the things that directly led to the council wanting to take a look at the NPUs and make these accusations about being too political was that folks at NPU meetings and in neighborhood associations and elsewhere were pushing for the council to get an electronic vote counting system, because up until that point, the council would like at some of your MP meetings, like, is there anyone opposed? No, okay. Or yays and nays and whatever else. But folks who wanted to hold their council members accountable couldn't do it because there was no record of my District 2 council member voted yes or no. So folks were really pushing for council to buy a electronic vote counting system so we would know on every vote the council takes how they voted. And because that was offensive, the people were stepping beyond their bounds. Council was interested in pushing back on this. Likewise, 1978 was just after an election, and there were some folks in NPUs who had decided that, hey, I know some stuff about the city. I'm connected with folks. I'm interested in running for office and challenging some of the incumbents. And folks in these offices were like, no, I don't want this competition. We need to keep politics out of NPU meetings. So 1979, so basically a year after this study had kicked off, the council receives the report from the subcommittee. They have the documentation from the GSU professor, and they adopt a series of amendments. And now these amendments that I'm starting to show you here, most of this is what we still have in the Code of Ordinances today. And if you see this stuff, you can understand that this wasn't necessarily the original piece, but this was early on, sort of that first revision to the NPU ordinance that set up much of what we have today. So first off, wanted to get some clarity on what NPUs should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, bring some focus back. So once again, still focused primarily on input into the comprehensive development plan, but folks had learned as well that the NPUs weren't just a good place to get input, but citizens were expecting, if the city's showing up, we've got questions for the city. We want to know about that issue. Why is my trash getting picked up? Or what was that crime that happened last night? Whatever else. So even though it wasn't necessarily intended to be the vehicle for that sort of information, but in a pre-internet era where you can just Google stuff or it can get sent to you via email, if on a monthly basis, folks from the city are going out to neighborhoods across the city to get information, then that's also a place to give information from the city. So that got codified for the first time, that it would be a place for citizens to get information on the functioning of the city, as well as more formally codifying that this wasn't just about the capital budget, like the physical structure budget, which is what the charter said it could be, but codifying that NPUs could and should be speaking about the operating budget, the city services that are provided on a daily basis. How is that money being spent? That gets put into the code for NPUs as well. Whereas initially the city said, here's some sample bylaws, take them under consideration. In 1979, the city said, you need to have bylaws. There needs to be some guiding document that someone who's new to the meeting, new to the organization can figure out what's going on. And there's going to be some requirements, exactly sort of how this happens. They need to be reviewed, they need to be updated. Once again, much the same as it is today. But that was first put in place with this review and revision in 1979. There was some timing that needed to happen on the elections, so that is something that got put in place in 1979, still exists basically today. Voting procedures, wanting to make sure that folks could engage in the processes, and if you needed to spell out in your bylaws exactly sort of how people got voting privileges, whether for an issue that's brought up during the meeting or for the election of that NPU's officers. And then lastly, as mentioned, there was concerns about NPUs becoming too political. So the council put down this requirement that the NPU meetings should not be used for political forums. So once again, all these things basically exist or are very, very similar to what exists in the NPU system and the Code of Ordinances today. Now, the other piece that I alluded to much earlier that got sort of picked up in this revision in 1979 was APAB, the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board, which was part of the initial conversations and plan for the city, that you were going to be working at neighborhood level, but also working at a citywide level. But as mentioned, there was no real agreement in the initial ordinance about exactly how that process would play out. So they gave themselves 60 days. The council gave themselves 60 days to come up with that, what the membership would look like and how the folks would get appointed or nominated to APAB. So what that initial proposal was back in 1974 was to have 18 voting members across the city, because you had 12 council districts and 6 at large, so a total of, so there was some connection between the two processes, and 5 non-voting members, which those were folks like folks from MARTA, from the state, from the county, folks that were able to engage in a citywide conversation because they also have citywide concern, but this was once again just a resident citizen sort of body and not just officials. The officials could be in the room, part of the conversation, but not giving voting privileges. Now, the voting or the selection process was quite complex in that either the neighborhood planning committee or the at-large council member needed to come up with a short list of people that could be on APAB, and then the district member would choose one of those and have them on the board. There were other situations where slightly sort of different sort of functioning, if those neighborhood planning committees weren't functioning, how they'd all get on there anyway. It was a mess. And once again, through 1976, the MPUs hadn't really started meeting yet. So even though the legislation is adopted in 74, it's not until 76 that MPUs are actually gathering to have these conversations. So nobody had ever got appointed. It's not too dissimilar from quite a few of the boards, authorities, commissions that are on the books today. They exist on paper, but they haven't actually gotten off the ground yet. So by 1978, when this review started, that was still the case with APAB. They existed on paper, but there was no actual APAB meeting. So as part of this review and revision, one of the proposals was we need to actually get APAB off the ground. So the way they did it was the council agreed to this and the mayor signed off on it, was to cut the mayor and the council out of the process, that it would just be the MPUs themselves choosing who they wanted to be their APAC designee, and that each of the MPUs would have 1 vote. So there'd be 24 members, 24 voting members of APAB. And then in 1980, they finally had their first meeting. So even though they existed on paper as far back as 1974, it wasn't until 1980 that they started meeting. So we basically have the MPU system that we had today back in 1979 or into 1980, but there have been some changes that happened since then, and I'll quickly go through some of these. So first off, back in the 1970s, as I mentioned, with those publications, there were federal dollars that were flowing into the city and other cities across the country to do engagement, to do planning. So the city had a dedicated staff of 18 folks, just focused on the MPU system. Quite a group of folks. As I mentioned before, there were some part-time folks, there were some interns, there was some senior level staff, so just a good mix of folks overall. But through the 1970s into the 1980s, federal government changed. You had recession came in about 1980 as well, and there wasn't the money to pay for as many folks as originally were on the team. So by 1985, with a transition in leadership at the city as well, from Mayor Jackson to Mayor Andy Young, who had some differences in perspective on what the MPU system should be, dwindled down to just two folks on staff. You had a coordinator and then an assistant, which if you've been with the MPU system for any length of time, at least pre-2019, that's basically what we still had up through about 2019, was just 2 people every day at City Hall who were thinking about MPUs full-time. The other thing that I forgot to mention here as well was there was actual change in where the MPUs sit in the organizational structure. So they were still at this point in the 1970s up through 1980s, still in the Department of Budget and Planning. But in 1982, they got pulled out of MPU, of the planning department, and were placed in a new department, or a new mayor's office. And I will get that here in just a second, because it has quite a name to it. The Mayor's Office of Community and Citizens Affairs. So Mayor Young pitched it as like, we need to be about implementation, and we want to make sure that folks at the MPUs have a direct connection, not just to the planners, but to department heads, to police zone commanders, all that sort of stuff. So he pitched it as like, this is an improvement to the system because we don't need to be doing as much planning anymore. We're about making sure that we're addressing citizens' needs on a monthly basis. So pulled it out of the planning entity or with the planners and pulled it into where citizens and community affairs was. So that's where it sat for quite some time until Maynard Jackson came back in office, and that's what I'll get to on the next slide. But key to know here is that there were a lot of folks working on the MPU system. There were federal dollars, there were university partners. A lot of stuff was sort of in full swing in the 1970s and the 1980s. Then as circumstances changed, as leadership changed, as perspective changed, we got a different sort of MPU system. Folks at that time realized, much as folks might realize today, across what was then still 24 MPUs, that when there wasn't a lot of staff support, then it became very dependent upon the volunteers across the city. And in a city that continues to be unequal, then folks who have the time and the resources, those MPUs could function fairly well. Those folks that don't have that capacity, they're working multiple jobs or don't have the other resources they might need, that were more dependent upon the city, then they suffered. So folks across the city were raising the alarm even back then, and hey, if the city's not coming to the table with planners, then how can we expect there to be equity across the system when folks are having to use their personal financial resources, their time, their connections to do planning, to have these conversations. So that has been a concern, at least once again, as far back as the early 1980s, when the city's resources started to dwindle to the MPU system. So to go through some of the changes that happened after that, in 1988, there had been attempts before, even back as far back as Maynard Jackson's terms, to require MPU officers to file financial disclosure reports. When that first got passed, Mayor Jackson vetoed it, but by 1988, it was back again on the table, and it stuck around. It didn't get vetoed in 1988. There was also a change to clarify that if you are with a business or an organization or a property, and those other things that aren't what those of us knowledgeable in the system would call residents, even though the city classifies them as residents, that entity that's not a real person still just gets one vote. So no matter how many people from that business or that church or other group show up, that entity is one thing and they get one vote. So you can't pack the room with a bunch of employees from a business and try to take over a vote or a meeting or whatever else. So that was clarified back in 1988. In 1990, as I mentioned, when Maynard Jackson came back, folks were like, whew, Maynard Jackson's back. Let's get this MPU system functioning the way it was before. City didn't have all the resources then, as it still struggles with sometimes today. So what he could commit to, the system we had up until fairly recently, was that you'd have folks in the planning department that weren't full-time dedicated to the MPUs, but they would be your dedicated planner for your NPU who would show up to your meetings. Even though most of their time at City Hall during the week would be spent on their various other tasks, they would be assigned to you as your NPU planner, and it was a one-to-one relationship. There weren't teams of folks at the NPU, and there wasn't full-time, but at least you'd start to get some planning staff back to NPUs to have conversations, and not just the other departments that would show up to give reports. There was a change in 1995 that required the chair to reside in NPU. So even though resident is broadly defined in the code as allowing for business owners and representatives, that sort of thing, there was a stipulation specifically for the chair placed in the Code of Ordinances in 1995 that the chair must have their place of residence in the geography of that NPU, and that the meetings must be open. So once again, that's something that we still have on the books today, that any NPU meeting or committee meeting has to be open. 1999, there had been a lot of discussion about the two generalized sort of forms of NPUs. There are those that are operate much like a town hall, that anybody and everybody who's at the meeting can vote, or there might be some restriction on you must have attended a certain number of meetings, those sort of things. There were folks that were very much in favor of that model of NPU. There were other folks that saw things differently, like that no, it's about strong neighborhood organizations and it's about this neighborhood planning committee, which is a smaller group of people that's still accountable to folks across the whole geography. But those are the folks that are meeting and voting on matters of the MPU. So disagreement back and forth with council about what's good, what's not good. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or like, no, this is completely anti-democratic. We need to not allow for one or the other to exist. So the compromise that it came out in 1999 was that at this annual vote of the bylaws, whatever voting restrictions you might have otherwise don't exist at that meeting. So any given year, an MPU might completely change the character of their organizational structure, because folks that otherwise might be disenfranchised from that meeting would be able to participate in the bylaws that then happen before the election of officers and lead to the membership and participation the following year. The other change that happened in 1999 was that alcohol license applicants were first required to appear. So this was something that back in the 1970s, they weren't folks trying to get a restaurant change of agent through your MPU. That was something that was brand new, that was codified, that the council put in. It's not something the planning department was directing. It's something that the city council was trying to be responsive to citizens saying, hey, this business activity is taking place in your neighborhood. We want some say in it. So the council put it into the code of ordinances that these applicants needed to appear. Quite similar in fashion, anytime the city was going to change the service fees, in 2000, that became something that needed to be reviewed by the MPUs. In 2004, finally, if you will, the requirement for the annual update to the plan went away. We still have a piece of the CDP, the capital improvement element that exists that we do every year for impact fees, but the general requirement that the whole document needs to be updated every year, that finally got removed from the code of ordinances in 2004. 2006 is when outdoor festival applicants were required to start coming to MPU meetings to have an appearance. That, once again, was not something that was part of the initial sort of plan on planning to be reviewing all these specific applications and processes. Now, through all of that stuff about these new things that got added on, you might be wondering about the other sort of applications that MPUs review regarding zoning matters and such. Well, that's still not in the code of ordinances. It is something that's just been a long-term practice of the planning department that is part of that overall process that applicants should go to an NPU meeting, or basically have to complete their application process. But that is not something that even to today exists in the code. It's the policy of the planning department. And looking back at early agendas for NPU meetings, it was not the long list of things you might receive at a meeting today. There were folks who were interested in, or they have a conversation with the applicant not there, but at least they would know, hey, there's going to be a zoning review board hearing. Let's get engaged in that process, versus a requirement that all of those applicants have to come to the MPUs. But around 2008, once again, because there's not a piece of code that spells it out, NPUQ was created. So we went from 24, which was the initially adopted number of MPUs, to 25, which is the number we still have today. So that's a change that led to other changes, such as the membership of APAB growing from 24 to 25. But that is something that's been unique to the creation of the MPU system, or the existence of the MPU system, that in other portions of the city, as Atlanta has annexed more territory, people have chosen to be annexed in, they have been added on to existing MPUs. But for the first time around 2008, when portions of Southwest Atlanta were annexed into the city, the decision was made by the administration to create a new NPU for that, for the folks living there. Then in 2012, MPUs by this time had not been as engaged in planning the overall budget of the city, but folks had needs in their communities. And Mayor Reed, during his administration, decided to start a program which is now called the CIG, the Community Improvement Grant. But back then it was just the MPU grant program, to be able to provide some direct funding, or at least funding through a fiscal agent or some other sort of sponsor, to be able to have MPUs have access to some money themselves to be able to do projects that they want to do, not just directing, or instead of the original intention, which was to help make sure that all departments, all offices of the city were being responsive to the financial wishes and priorities of those respective neighborhoods across the city. So then much more recently, or continuing to get more recent, in 2017, we had the Atlanta City Design that was adopted into the charter. So if you look at a charter now, there's a new section that precedes the CDP section, the Comprehensive Development Plan section, which is the Atlanta City Design. So it does not have to get renewed and replaced the same way that the CDP does. There's now a requirement from the Department of Community Affairs of the state of Georgia that the city and other cities across the state basically need to update their CDP or their comprehensive plan, because nobody else calls it the CDP. They just call it the comprehensive plan or comp plan. But they need to update it every 5 years in order to maintain their status as a qualified local government, to be able to get access to certain funding, to be able to do things like zoning and that sort of stuff. Those are requirements that exist at the state level. But 2017, under then Planning Commissioner Tim Keene, decided like, hey, we need to get our focus back again, understand what the city wants to be. So put in a brand new document that maybe you've seen the published copy or seen it online. This is the Atlanta City Design. 2019, the organization I work with, the Center for Civic Innovation, launched an MPU initiative. We had heard conversations and been involved in conversations about people that were curious about the MPU system, about its story, or had challenges with how their MPU was functioning, or had challenges with how the city was engaging or not engaging with their MPUs. So we gathered folks together to have those conversations. Then, as sort of stated here, the city started making some changes internally as well. Our current NPU director, Leah LaRue, had a little organizational shift within the Department of City Planning and the team had a little shift from where the folks were sort of, maybe not technically sort of seated, but the city was starting to rethink what's going on at City Hall, and that there were some unmet needs and desires from citizens across the city, and that the city maybe should start increasing staffing. And as you suspect from being on this call now, there are more than 2 people that work on the MPU team at the city. That growth started happening in 2019. 2020, with some of that growth, with some of the ideas, with some new level of sort of responsiveness from the city regarding the MPUs, there were new initiatives, new programs launched, such as what we are in here now, MPU University, the MPU dashboard, other sort of things that the folks that are on the MPU team have helped sort of bring to life in the past few years. But we can't ignore that there was also a pandemic that fundamentally changed lots of things, both at City Hall as well as MPUs across the city. So for one, MPUs went online, hopped on Zoom, thanks to some technical support from the city. But MPUs also were responding to the needs in their communities in ways they hadn't been responsive to before. Although there had been obviously folks in neighborhood organizations doing all sorts of social services work and checking in on folks. During the pandemic, there were people using the MPU structure to do those wellness checks on seniors, to folks who needed medication, who needed access to things. It was MPUs doing things that they never had to do before, but because that structure existed, folks were able to provide connection with their neighbors, be able to provide resources in a plethora of ways. 2022, as we're coming out of the pandemic, Council introduced and passed legislation encouraging the Department of City Planning to work with APAT, the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board, to come up with some best practices for MPUs. That was a iterative process, and in 2022, that document got published. It is still a living, breathing document that is ripe for conversation and revision. But in the same year, there was also some thought about changing some of these MPU boundaries. That rubbed some council members the wrong way. And going back to those initial piece of legislation regarding what Mayor Jackson and the administration thought about who should be coming up with the criteria and the boundaries, and where the council thought their powers sort of were, that still was not perfectly clear, or people on both sides of the atrium at City Hall saw things a little differently. But council changed the ordinance for that piece to say that the designation of the MPUs or any change in those boundaries would require council approval in 2022. And then last year, there was a strategic planning effort that the city was leading with APAB. Obviously, there's lots of other stuff that has been going on. There have been the community or corner conversations, all sorts of stuff, but hopefully the NPU team that exists today can tell you about all that stuff. And I wanted to bring you up as close as I can here to 2024 with what's been going on. So as we are here today, we have 25 NPUs across the city because we now have NPU-Q as well. So the only one that's missing is you. But now we have NPU University to fill in the missing letter for us. But that's where we have come across these 50 years. The chat is a little bit crazy, but as we have time left, would love to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you so much for that, Kyle. That was amazing. And I see that Zach's hand is up. So with 20 minutes to go, I will not belabor my point. Zach?
Yes, ma'am. This was so interesting. So thank you, Kyle, and thank you to the NPU team for putting this on. Kyle, I just was wondering, I've been doing sort of our own for NPU, a little bit of historical research on everyone who has been chair of NPUX. And I think I have the full list. I don't have the exact years. But do you have any resources on where maybe other NPUs can go to track down that information? And I would just urge any other NPU chairs on the call. There's living history in your neighborhood in those former chairs. So if you are blessed enough to have a lot of historical NPU chairs still around, I would definitely take this 50th anniversary as the opportunity to just reach out to them and see their story, because it really can be interesting and amazing. But Kyle, any tips and resources you have would be greatly appreciated.
So I have bits and pieces here and there, and I'm happy to work with anyone to try to fill in the gaps or at least provide a lead. But as you sort of stated, I think the best way to get a comprehensive list is to start with the people that you do know, the people who have been involved in the NPUs, and find out who was there with them or before them or came after them, who they passed the baton to or they received the baton from. But there are some resources that are available with some agendas that exist or some notices in the paper. A decent resource, if you have access to it, I can share what information I have from the AJC's archives. Regardless of what was going on, they would use the NPU directory to have interviews and conversations with folks. So they would interview someone and they would identify them as the chair of NPU-X, for instance. So even though it might have nothing to do with NPU-X, because there was something of interest that was happening in the NPU or that geography, the reporters would say, who can I speak to get some on-the-ground insight or perspective on that? They would often reach out to an NPU chair to get that information. But I would love to see what you've got for X. I'm happy to share what I've got. And maybe for this 50th anniversary, we can try to fill in any gaps that we have. But yeah, there's been tons and tons of people and lots of familiar faces. There's lots of folks who were involved in the NPU system and now are somewhere else. Some of them are on city council, but other folks are involved in other political and non-political things. Yeah, it's been very cool. And thanks for chiming in, Zach.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to, before we go, I'll mention a couple of opportunities to plug some of those legacy residents and legacy former chairs, et cetera, into the 50th anniversary celebration. Jennifer Brooks.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for this amazing class, Kyle, and NPU staff. It's wonderful. And it's also wonderful to see so many people with their cameras on, because now as we're getting used to Zoom, a lot of people are hiding, but look at this. I mean, what other group has so many faces actually on? So thank you all for having your cameras on. And you alluded to things are different, Kyle, back then to what's on the books today. So I just wonder, do we need another class on what's on the books today, or is that covered in one of these classes? Because I have to say, my learning curve, I've been going to NPU meetings for like 10 years, and I still don't really understand enough about how it functions to feel, smart enough to participate on some level. So yeah, do we need another class or is it covered somewhere else?
Kyle is waiting for me to answer, I think.
Well, I will say, back to the research that I was working on with the Center for Innovation through the NPU initiative work, tried to pour over the Code of Ordinances to sort of see what's in the laws today that where NPUs are supposed to receive notification or supposed to be involved in some sort of process. I know Daniel on the NPU team has done some of that work as well. Council continues to pass ordinances and sort of change things, create things, and other things sort of go away. So it's a living, breathing thing, but I think it would be good, this is my personal opinion, to pull something together, whether it's a class or a handout or a website, some sort of go-to resource where folks know about that. One of the things that I think has been, once again, sort of personal opinion, sort of lacking, is there were federal programs that helped lead to the creation of the NPU system. And the city has to create things like a citizen participation plan to tell the federal government about how they're doing citizen engagement and participation. The NPU system was created for that purpose, or partly to fulfill some of those federal requirements. Over time, the NPU system has grown in its direction, as you have seen with various other sort of things on its agenda. The federal processes have changed somewhat. So I think sometimes there's things that reference that the NPUs should be engaged, or there's opportunities that exist, but they aren't as engaging anymore. Or maybe you get notice at the NPU meeting that there's this other public hearing and you have to sort of do it, versus trying to bring those things back into the fold to engage with people that are routinely meeting on these topics and are thinking of things synthetically across years or across different sort of topic areas, versus the transportation folks just want to think about transportation. No, let's make sure that we're also thinking about other aspects that affect transportation as well. So maybe Leah can be working on her team working on a class, but I think there should be some resource, and hopefully we can help pull that together in this anniversary year.
Yeah, we are. I know one thing. My head is and my office are both full of all kinds of potential solutions, ideas, big visions, and frankly, I don't know. I part of me wants to say we just don't have enough human resources to pull it off, and the other part of me wants to make sure that I point out how grateful I am that the city and the Department of City Planning has invested in neighborhood planning units in the way that we have. When I started in this role in 2019, as Kyle pointed out, the only person on the team was Daniel. It was a team of one, and then me. So that was just 2019, less than 5 years ago. We had no budget at all. No budget at all. Today we have 9 staff members and still growing, and everybody it's crazy to me because every time they add someone, that person comes into the door underwater. They come in the door drinking from a water hose, already swamped and super busy because there was work waiting for them when they get here. So there's plenty of ideas, and I definitely want to. I'm trying to give the short answer because it's 7:48, but we definitely want to produce some educational materials. And Kyle and I talked in a recent meeting about videos and just ways to make sure people know not just that the system exists. We don't want you to just show up at your meeting. We want you to know what to expect when you get there, to know how you can participate, how you can be involved, and what your participation means. That's the key. So many people, I see it all the time. They raise their hands to vote yay or raise their hands to vote nay and really don't get the big picture of what they're voting and how it connects to so many other things. So we really do want to fix that. Sean Mosley, and thank you, Miss Melody. Sean?
Yeah, and please let me know if the background noise is too much. I hear with my kids and all this stuff. The question I have is kind of similar to Jennifer's about like understanding what the NPUs can do. And so I'm kind of interested in hearing, are there examples of things that the NPUs have accomplished that like we can reference to see for inspiration and say like, oh wow, this NPU has accomplished this. They got a pool put in, or they changed how this went. Like, are there examples of like good outputs from NPU activism?
Leah's smiling, and I'm sure she's got some specific examples. I know they've been trying to collect them, particularly from the grant programs that have been going on as of late. Not too dissimilar from some of the stuff I mentioned that sort of led to the creation of the NPU system, that folks were already somewhat in an opposition mindset. And even if you go to a meeting today, oftentimes folks are looking to stop whatever project is coming in. So that's what is more in the headlines. What's more the sort of historical record of sort of what NPUs have been about. But there are definitely instances where folks have used the NPU as a vehicle, or through that conversation then have started something else, or have gotten plugged into their neighbor association where there aren't the restrictions that the city can place on an NPU to be able to do some of that work. So we'll make sure I'll share some information of some of those examples, but there are definitely instances where folks have been very instrumental. As I mentioned early on, one of the things that folks in the NPU system were doing was like, we want to make sure that council, there's a record of what they voted on and how they voted on it. So some of the things have been quite political, which is why some of the legislation has been changed to sort of remove NPUs from politics. But there have been lots of opportunities, as I mentioned too, during the pandemic, where folks have been using the NPUs to take care of their neighbors, to do some self-help, not dependent upon any city resources, but organizing and engaging with their neighbors directly through the NPUs. And then there's lots of plans that neighborhoods have worked on either on their own and gotten approved through the city or in partnership with the city to help shape what their neighborhood looks like today, or at least what they want it to look like in the very near future, and that whole process. So you might be able to tie exactly this change in the neighborhood to that plan, but without those sort of precursors once again being in place, it wouldn't have laid that groundwork for that neighborhood to grow in the way that they were hoping they would at the start of the process.
Yeah, and Sean, if you want to shoot me an email, we've been talking internally about how to tell the story, and that's such a huge part of the storytelling. My head is swimming with concrete examples of change affected directly by NPUs, where NPUs got together and said, power to the people. We're not going down like this. And they organize and they fight back and they actually win the fight. We actually talked to some chairs at our 2022 appreciation dinner, asking them to tell us some of those stories. We captured some of them, and some I just know from being around. 2021, anybody? I'll be trying to be diplomatic there, but NPUs have definitely flexed their power in ways that have been very, very impactful. And I'm happy to talk more about that with you when we have some time. Last question is, oh, go ahead.
One that comes to mind, which I think also shows how NPUs can organize across NPU boundaries. If you're familiar with what we now call Ponce City Market, which was Sears Building and then City Hall East, when the city never fully utilized the building, and there were folks, for quite some time interested in finding out how that relatively underutilized building could become something that was much greater asset to the neighborhood, pre lots of the Beltline conversation. But the Ponce City Market sits at the nexus of 4 different NPUs, but those leaders of those NPUs, folks in those NPUs said, hey, we want to get together and we're going to bring the mayor to the conversation. We're going to tell Shirley Franklin what we want out of this project. They basically had a community benefits agreement with the city to shape what that project was going to become. Now, things didn't quite turn out the way that they wanted to, because there was a change in mayor, change in economic circumstances. The developer who was going to do it sort of didn't happen. But then when Mayor Reed came in, there was another developer who was interested. Once again, there was already a playbook, and there were neighbors ready to engage in that process. Now, we can all debate exactly if Ponce City Market is what any of us would want it to be or whatever else, but that project as it exists today was fundamentally shaped by neighbors getting together, not to oppose something that was coming in, but like, hey, we see this physical asset that could benefit our neighborhoods. How do we help make the city shape it to what the neighborhood really needs?
And on a daily basis, there are conversations happening around City Hall where I'm invited to either sit in or weigh in on conversations about proposed ideas and things. And just I can see how things have changed over the last few years. These days, just a whisper of, oh, the MPUs would have a fit over that. It changes the conversation. Just that sentence changes the conversation here at City Hall. So the work that y'all are doing, to the folks in the class, the work that y'all are doing is working. We've got plenty to do, plenty of opportunity for growth and improvement, but it's working. Last question coming from Kristen Collins, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hi, thanks. I hope this is quick. We've been talking about the relationship of the MPUs with the city as is appropriate, but is there any history or anything you can comment on of the MPUs with the neighborhood associations? We have 3 different large neighborhood associations that make up my NPU. They're very varied. And was there any thought process as to what kind of weight they would have? Because we have a very tentative relationship with some of our neighborhood associations.
Yeah, so it is one of those things that is not standardized across the city. If you remember back to those early maps and sort of where the red circles and such were, there are some places where the NPU was the first sort of organizational structure in that geography. So people were showing up, they had not already sort of gathered as a community organization and just showing up like, hey, let's use this vehicle that the city's provided to start to have those conversations. There were other geographies where the neighborhoods associations pre-existed the MPU system, already had incorporation with the state of Georgia, all sorts of things they had sort of already accomplished or were working towards. And in those places tend to be those that now have the style of NPU where the neighborhood associations have representatives that are the voting members of that body. The sort of prototypical NPU that the city was looking at, the city staff was looking at, trying to sort of figure out how neighborhood associations might work together and what role they might play, is what is basically NPU O now, or N, sorry, NPU N. I see Amy Stout on the call. With BOND, with the Bass Organization for Neighborhood Development, that there were folks around Little 5 Points and the Bass School, that's now Lofts, trying to shape the positive development of their neighborhood, and how those sort of self-organized and had come up with a plan. They had a neighborhood plan that existed before the comprehensive development plan. And someone I've not mentioned, although some of her documents were in the presentation, was our first female member of the Board of Aldermen and then the council, Pinky Bradley. When she was involved with and saw what BOND had pulled together, that's one of the things that she wanted to implement across the city. So there was an example of stuff with economic opportunity in Atlanta, but there were also examples of neighborhoods that were not necessarily dependent upon federal programs to get off the ground. That was the other example. But today, I think that continues to be a struggle. Lots of the language that's in the NPU ordinance and sort of how it got started talks about neighborhoods, but not neighborhood organizations. And there's some where those things align. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes who's in leadership changes and such. But when the NPU system was created in those sort of sample bylaws and such, there were some contemplations about, once again, organizations that, or NPU geographies, where there were neighborhood organizations that were ready to come to the table and do stuff. And other ones where that didn't exist, there was, hey, let's figure out how we can use the NPU as convening to then bring neighbors together, and you can form your own neighborhood association or civic association. So we're still sort of in some of that limbo land today. There have been some of those conversations, as I mentioned, back in 1999 about sort of voting and organizational representation and such. Some of that was spurred by, I think, MPUW and how they were set up, which is a little bit of a sort of hybrid situation where there's multiple folks representing a neighborhood organization. But even in MPUB, there's clearly some strong neighborhoods, and this is B in Buckhead and W sort of down towards Grant Park, but where there's a recognition of neighborhoods, but not tying them one-to-one to any specific neighborhood organization or entity or the lack thereof. but trying to find opportunities for folks that aren't affiliated with any organization to still be able to have a voice through the MPU system.
And I can add to that. Thanks for that question, Kristen. That was a great one. I can add to that I've had some conversations recently about introducing to the discussion in phase 3, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But phase 3 of the 50th anniversary is I don't forgot the darn name of it, but it's about planning for the future, planning ahead. Oh, there it is, planning Atlanta together. When we get to phase 3, and I've had conversations recently about introducing to that conversation the relationship with neighborhood associations and city and neighborhood associations and the MPU. We want to just make sure that that's included in the conversations that we have with the community. Okay, so thank you so much, Kyle. I'm not ready yet, Sam. Just one second. I want to thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. The class was amazing. I know that if we were in person, everyone would be clapping and cheering very loudly. But thank you. This was amazing. It was a perfect summary of the many conversations that we've had. I planned on multitasking and trying to get some work done during the class. I could not focus on anything but this. So thank you a lot. I do want to talk real quickly, like the 30-second version of our 50th anniversary this year. As you learned in Kyle's presentation tonight, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Neighborhood Planning Unit system. It was created in 1974, and we're really excited. We've put together a year-long celebration starting on January 22nd with a proclamation that was issued at Atlanta City Council and ending in December. So we'll actually ending next year, because December is really just the beginning of our future planning for reimagining the MPU system. But we talked a little bit about some of the historic leaders of the MPU system, some of the folks that have been around. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a quick shout out to at least 3 folks that I saw here that served as MPU chairs for many, many, many years. Miss Ola Reynolds, who retired after serving as chair for 14 years. Mr. Russian, who is still serving as chair. I think he's probably close to 14 years or something like that. And Forrest Coley, who took a break and came back to serve some more as chair. So we appreciate, I don't even know how many years Forrest Coley has serving MPUM, but thank you so much to those of you and anyone whose name I didn't mention who has served your MPU and thereby the city of Atlanta, because it really is a thankless role. That said, we are in the first phase of the 50th anniversary, which is January through April. We will be celebrating our legacy leaders and honoring our past. It's called the Legacy of Love. And we will have multiple opportunities for you all to participate and to share with us any of your findings. Zach, I know you said you were doing some research. Any of you who know folks that have been around for a long time, that may have been around in the 70s or in the 80s, or you yourselves, if you were around in the 70s or 80s, please reach out to us and let us know so that we can contact them. On March 18th, we'll have Public Engagement Day here at City Hall. That whole week is Legacy Week. It's also the week of Mayor Maynard Jackson's birthday, so we'll be celebrating in conjunction with the mayor's office, who's celebrating the 50th anniversary of Maynard Jackson's historic election, or historic inauguration, rather. But on the 18th is Public Engagement Day. Then on the 21st, we'll have the Inheritance and Legacy of Civic Power, a conversation with Atlanta's MPU Trailblazers. So we'll have a panel discussion with a few of our long-serving NPU Trailblazers, the folks who were around then. On March 22nd, we'll have Maynard Jackson Day at Maynard Jackson High School. We'll be celebrating them as well. And then we have an art activation. I'm not really sure what to call that, but we'll do an art exhibit featuring some of the art from the MPUs themselves, from from artists in each NPU. We'll have an exhibit that's later on in April. And then in the summertime, we'll be doing some block parties. We're selecting 4 neighborhoods at which we will sponsor block parties in the summertime, May, June, July, and August. But then in phase 3, we will begin planning for the future. We'll start working on those CCI recommendations that came maybe 2 years ago, I think, from their NPU initiative, and working on all of the feedback that we've collected over the past few years from you and your neighbors, wanting improvements, wanting enhancements to the NPU system, wanting to know why we don't do this and why we don't do that, or why can't we do this. Some of you have some really good ideas. So we want to compile all of that and really just kick off the conversation. We'll be starting this by introducing an engagement plan somewhere between October and December, and then we'll actually start doing the work towards the end of the year to implement the ideas that come from you all. So that's all I wanted to say about the 50th. Samantha has a couple of upcoming classes and events that she wants to share with you as well, and she will close us out. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. I appreciate all that you do to make our city and our community better.
Okay, so well, here we go. We have some upcoming courses and events. As you can see on your screen, we have our upcoming NPU University courses, our zoning fundamentals, reducing property taxes and homestead tax exemptions, and our building permits and seller for beginners course, which are our next 3 courses that we will be teaching. Leah went over our legacy events, which are also on the screen as well. And then we have our Plan A kickoff for Atlanta's Comprehensive Development Plan, which will be Thursday, February 29th from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. at Greenbrier Mall. All these events can be found on npuatlanta.org. Specifically, if you would like to get more information and register for the Plan A kickoff at the end of the month, you can scan this QR code right now with your phone. I'm going to leave that up for a few seconds for those who would like to So that's Thursday, February 29th from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. at Greenbrier Mall. RSVP today. And thank you so much for participating tonight. If you would like more information on all things that are NPU University, as well as our 50th events, please follow us at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at NPU Atlanta, on TikTok at NPU Atlanta, and City of Atlanta Neighborhood Planning Units on Nextdoor. Good night, y'all.
If those were too many events and you can't do anything but one, please, 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 February 29th, comprehensive plan kickoff. It's the most important thing that the city is doing this year. It is the single most important thing that the city is doing this year. The kickoff is February 29th, Greenbrier Mall. Please come to that if you can't do anything else. See you then.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.